webinar on neighboring rights. My name is Abby North, and I will be moderating the webinar today. IAFAR is the Independent Alliance for Artist Rights. We're very fortunate today to have IAFAR board members Naomi Asher and Tausis, Shari Hoffman, and Dennis Dreith. So brief introductions. Based in London, and Tausis is CEO of Kobalt Neighbouring Rights and Treasurer, Secretary, and Vice Chair of IAFAR. Also based in London, although brief respite here in Los Angeles, we have Naomi Asher, VP of Neighbouring Rights at Sony ATV, and President and Chair of the Board of IAFAR. And then based in Los Angeles, we have Shari Hoffman, CEO of Transparence Entertainment Group. Previously, Shari was the COO of the AFM SAG-AFTRA Intellectual Property Distribution Fund. And then also in Los Angeles, we've got Dennis Dreith, Chairman of Transparence Entertainment Group, and previously Executive Director of the AFM SAG-AFTRA Intellectual Property Distribution Fund. I would like to introduce my friend, Peggy Dold. Peggy represents the sponsor of this webinar, First Horizon Iberia Bank. Peggy is a music veteran with over 39 years. I know that's impossible to believe, but Peggy has over 39 years of experience working in this industry. She's now Senior Vice President of Sports and Entertainment Banking for First Horizon Iberia Bank. Iberia Bank and First Horizon Bank are two well-established financial institutions that merged just 2.5 months ago. So now I will hand it over to Peggy.
Thank you, Abby. When the Sports and Entertainment Group invited me to help lead its music division, they wanted someone from inside of the music industry, where I've worked for more than 20 years in both the Anglo and Hispanic music markets. Someone who understands the complexities of the industry's economics so that we can better serve our music clients. To that end, we're proud to support the Songwriters of North America and the Independent Alliance for Artists' Rights, as these esteemed panelists educate our music industry community about the misunderstood but extremely important royalty stream. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy. I now hand it over to Naomi Asher. And Naomi, let me know if you'd like me to start the slides now or if there's anything you'd like to say.
Yeah, I'll just give a bit, thank you very much for that, Abby. I'll give you a little bit of background on IAFAR and then we'll get started. So IAFAR is essentially, as like the NMPA or MPA is to publishing, is what IAFAR is to neighboring rights. It's, very different income stream from publishing. There's a lot of ins and outs of neighboring rights that a lot of people are confused by. It's quite a complicated income stream compared to publishing, only because it's newer and, there's not a lot of transparency, and things are very different and vary significantly from territory to territory. And there are a lot of income stream wide issues that we as a group are trying to tackle. That's what we were founded for, is to essentially try and make a difference in this income stream. And one of the key parts of that is education, making sure that everybody knows what neighboring rights are, and really being able to help people, who should be earning money from this income stream understand it and make sure they know that this is something that they should be looking at. Do you want to go ahead and start the slideshow?
I will do that. And I just want to remind everybody that we're holding questions till the end. But hold on.
Just to say, we would love everybody who watches a slideshow to become a member of IAFAR. Excuse me. And, at the end of this, there will be a discount code on the slideshow. So anybody who wants to be, to sign up immediately, or, once they've seen this, please do. And the slideshow will be available on our website, as as our other education materials in the members only section. And obviously we'll have questions at the end, but if there's other questions that don't get answered, you can always email, and we can see what we can get to in terms of trying to help you out in the neighboring rights arena. Do you want to go to the next slide?
Yes.
So what are neighboring rights? That's the biggest question. Neighboring rights, which are also called related rights, essentially sit next to or neighbor publishing copyrights. Anybody who makes an audible contribution to a recording is able to earn neighboring rights. There are two sets of people essentially that earn money from this income stream. It's the label, anybody who owns the recording, and whoever makes an audible contribution to the recording. So that is what they are. It's not about who wrote the song, it's about who performed on the song. In most territories, this royalty comes from public performance via license fees. So if you're in the UK and you're at a Starbucks and they're playing music in public, there's a license fee that is paid for the sound recording as well as for the publishing. Whereas in America, there's only a license fee paid for the publishing. So if you're outside of the US territory, any music that's played in public is going to be earning a neighboring right as well as a publishing royalty. In addition, terrestrial radio and terrestrial television channels outside of the US. In the US, it's satellite and digital radio. So this is where the money comes from. It's not something that comes from the same place as, say, artist royalties. It's not a publishing payment. This is a separate payment that comes from public performance royalties. Next slide, please. There are sources that don't pay currently for, don't pay neighboring rights. So interactive streaming is one which doesn't pay neighboring rights. That means you can't earn money from neighboring rights from Spotify, YouTube, Deezer, Apple Music, Amazon Prime, any of those. Those currently don't pay neighboring rights. Now, saying that, we are trying to make this different, and the whole world essentially now, as people are looking for more income streams and different ways of earning money from music, there is a lot of activity in this arena. And Spain recently won a lawsuit against Spotify to pay out neighboring rights. Hungary is now paying neighboring rights for Deezer, but this is all very much the beginnings of that. It's not something where, you know, if you've got 1 billion streams on Spotify, you probably will earn money because of public performance aspect. But if you have no radio play whatsoever, then chances are, you know, you're not going to earn what you think you might earn from this, because Spotify isn't going to pay you in most of the world for the neighboring rights. Also, there are some roles that don't pay. Arranger, it is paid in the US, but the majority of, you know, the rest of the world, it's not a payable role for neighboring rights. Engineers, executive producer, remixer, mixer. Now, Sound Exchange can direct a percentage of royalties to mixers or producers. There's something called a Sound Exchange letter of direction. Anybody who's a producer or a mixer should definitely talk to the featured artist that they're working with and get a Sound Exchange letter of direction. Otherwise, it's really important, and we'll talk more about producers later, to essentially make sure the credit is one which will allow you to get paid outside of the US territory. Arranger is something that actually would happen via the AFM SAG-AFTRA fund. I think Dennis can probably talk more about that later. But for the most part, these are non-payable roles when you're talking about neighboring rights. And you go to the next slide. And for this just is a visual to show you essentially what I'm talking about in terms of a separate royalty from publishing. So if something is playing in public, if Whitney Houston's version of I Will Always Love You is playing in public, you have a royalty that goes to the publishing composition, which would be to Dolly Parton and her publisher. And then you have a separate royalty, totally separate, that goes to the sound recording. So in this example for I Will Always Love You, it would be RCA, which is the label, and Whitney Houston and anybody else who made an audible contribution to that recording. So synthesizer, bass, guitar, drum, sax solo, if somebody had come in and yelled hi and that was audible on the recording, that would be payable. It's only the audible contributions and the label that gets paid this income stream. The other column is separate, that's publishing, and that is something that this income stream does not include. It's totally separate. And I think with that, Anne is going to pick up from me.
Okay, so yeah, Naomi has already touched on this a bit, but so it's anyone who then performs a musical part or an audible part on a recording gets paid. And as an example, then it could be the contracted feature, so Mick Jagger. Other featured could be when Rolling Stones featuring Lady Gaga. So Lady Gaga would be the other featured. And then you have the non-featured, which are any session musicians and band members who are not the contracted feature with the label. So Bobby Keys playing saxophone on a Rolling Stones track, that's an example of a non-featured. And when it comes to these different categories, which one you fall into, that's you can check the record contract to see what's actually in there. And also one thing that is important is that these roles, whatever you've been playing or contributed to recording, that is actually that is documented somewhere, because there are a lot of societies who ask for evidence that something that proves that you were actually contributing to a specific recording. So that's a very important part. And also one thing, if you have played multiple instruments on a recording, then list each one of them individually rather than saying all instrument. Just list each one, because otherwise you actually end up being paid probably for less than you actually did on a recording. Next slide, please. So how is it different from publishing? Again, Naomi touched on that. So I think one thing to mention, and I think I always say that publishing is a little bit easier in the sense that, you know, in publishing, you have written a song. If you've written 25% of that song, that is your percentage wherever that song is used anywhere in the world. It stays as your 25%. In neighbouring rights, if you've played the drums, let's say, what you're being paid differs country by country based on the rules. So that's kind of the biggest difference, I would say. And of course, also the fact that you're dealing with completely different societies here then. So if, you know, the publishing societies, of course, are the ASCAPs and BMIs of the world. And then you have neighbouring rights, which are completely separate organizations. So Sound Exchange, of course, in the US would pay neighbouring rights related income, PPL in the UK, while in the UK, it's PRS who deals with the publishing bit. And another thing that I think lots of people actually don't know is that what needs to happen on the neighbouring rights side is that the label needs to submit information about a recording. So they need to register the actual recording before anyone who has performed on that can go on and make their claims. If the recording isn't there, you can't claim your share. So that is a very important thing to know about, and especially today, as we have lots of artists who are actually their own label, they're self-releasing, then they need to actually go and register as a label first of all, and then go in and claim also their performer share. Next slide, please. And then cover recordings, what about those? Yes, you do get paid for those. We have an example here, Valerie. So the writers would get paid on the left-hand side there. They would get paid from the performing rights organizations, PRS, ASCAP, BMI, and so on for the copyright. Then you have the original artist, the Zootons. They would, in addition to that, they would be paid by PPL and other neighbouring rights organizations for when that particular recording is played. And then you have Amy Winehouse, who did a cover of this song, and she would then only be paid by the neighbouring rights societies, so the PPL and Sound Exchange and so on. And then also her label would get a share. Usually it's split 50-50 there, so her label would get a share and she would get a share, and anyone else who performed on that recording for the neighbouring rights bit. Next slide, please. Yeah, and when we're talking about producers, so on the label side, so it's the label right, the label is also called a producer, so this gets a little bit confusing because you of course also have a studio producer. But when neighbouring rights and you're talking about the master recording, then it's the label is classified as the producer. And in the US, Sound Exchange would pay both the label and the featured artist, and then they pass through the non-featured performer artist to the IAFAR IPRD fund. So that's 5% of the income that Sound Exchange collects, they pay through, and then IAFAR fund, they then work through that and then pay to non-featured performers. And Naomi mentioned before as well that studio producers can get a share of the featured artist share at Sound Exchange, and that's based on a letter of direction which the featured artist will have signed to say they want to give away a share of their own share to the studio producer. In the UK, we have PPL. They manage both the label side and the performer side. In Belgium, you have Playwright, who deals with the performer share, but you have a different society for the label side. In Brazil, there's loads of societies. I have lost count how many there are, but there you have some that deal with both neighbouring rights and the publishing bit. So all different constellations on that. So it makes it a little bit more complex. There's lots of players to deal with. Studio producers, what else can we say here? Yeah, we talked about the letter of direction there. Some countries do pay US performer if the master is recorded in a Rome Convention country, performed by a citizen of a Rome Convention country, or funded by a Rome Convention label or producer, and in some cases has a simultaneous release in a Rome Convention country. This, I mean, just reading it, it just sounds very complicated, and this is the reason why neighbouring rights is complicated. Is based on old legislation back in the 60s, early 60s. And it's also based on reciprocity. So, and that is the reason why we mentioned that as a US performer, you might not get paid from everywhere in the world. There's a handful of countries who pay US performers, but it's based then on reciprocity. So because the US don't have the terrestrial broadcast right, then there are some societies like PPL in the UK who would say that, well, you don't pay us for terrestrial rights, so we won't pay you. But the fact that the US actually pay lots of money, more than anyone in the world, for the money that they're actually collecting, which is, you know, to the digital radio stuff, that doesn't sort of come into play. But that is also the reason then why it becomes so complicated. So lots of different rules for different countries in how they're qualifying people for payment. And those are some of the things that actually come into play here. So you would have to have like a massive diagram and kind of tick the boxes and say, this is who I am, this is who my label is, and this is where we're based. And then see where would I actually qualify for payment. And then you need to go and claim that. That is the reason why neighbouring rights is as complicated as it is. Next slide.
Hello. So I'm going to touch a little bit on what Anne mentioned. This is still talking about the label side, the rights holder, the rights owner, the producer, as it's referred to in foreign territories. If you don't credit your performers, it's going to be hard for them to get their income, and it's sometimes not at all. The only exception I can think of is Sound Exchange, who was just named by the RIAA, the designee for ISRC data in the United States. So, for example, there's a lot of independent artists out there, especially now in COVID, if not beforehand. People are self-releasing their own product, holding on to their masters. And it's really important that not only do you make yourself on the label side as the label rights holder, that you also register as a performer, because you have additional income to receive. Now, part of the metadata that's really, really important is those ISRC codes, and other societies often ask for the duration of the track to do matching, et cetera, et cetera. Each society has its own rules of what they need to properly track the different recordings, because there's so many different versions of recording. It's really important that you list them all. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else on this slide. Oh, yes. Also, if you are registering the tracks as the rights holder and you don't register it timely, your artists aren't going to get paid and you're not going to get paid. You can't go retro on that. It's going to take effect from the date that you register the recording with the collective management organization that you're working with. Next. How do studio producers get paid? Okay, this varies. In the United States, I think that Anne and Naomi touched upon this. Sound exchange requires a letter of direction from the featured artist. This has also been expanded under the Music Modernization Act to engineers. So if in lieu of that, an artist may be able, a studio producer may be able to get paid through the AFM and SAG-AFTRA Intellectual Property Rights Distribution Fund. That would require that they have an audible contribution to the recording and can prove it as such. So it is really important in modern day that producers put all roll codes they have, not just list themselves as a producer. This varies in the United Kingdom. It's a special form called an eligible studio producer form signed by the featured artist in order to get paid. In Switzerland, they have their own artistic producer form. And there's particular countries that are also included that pay producers as producers. That includes Germany and Japan. In Japan, if you're actually listed on the credits as a producer, you'll get paid as a featured artist. If not, you may have to do some proving, but you'll be paid as a non-featured producer. So let's see, what else? So I did mention all of this. Certain things to remember is put all your roll codes. So you put yourself down as a musician in every aspect, every instrument you played, and you would also put yourself down as a vocalist. If you had sang, if you had done beatbox, if you whistled. Musician roles include hand clapping, some of the uniqueness, playing a triangle. Next. Okay, language matters. This is really, really important. So if you put yourself down as a beats producer, then you're likely not going to be paid neighboring rights for your contribution. The proper wording in most territories is drum programmer or drummer. They're not going to use that. They're going to take that word producer and discount it. So again, it's really important how you state things. And if you aren't sure, you can either ask somebody at the collective management organization you're working with, or just list them all. List those extra codes. It's not going to hurt you. Next. Samples. So samples are running rampant these days. Everybody's sampling everything. So I'm going to use you an example of Beyonce's Bootylicious. Used a direct sample of Stevie Nicks' Edge of 17. So all the musicians, I believe, are eligible to be paid for that because that entire track, the sample from that track included the musicians that participated. There's oftentimes that's not the case, that a sample will be just a guitar riff from a particular song. In that case, only the guitarist is going to get paid. We've come across some things, Dennis and I, in our former role at the fund, that we had to prove that other instruments were audibly heard on that sample, even though the CMO may have discounted it at the time, but it's an upward battle. So you have to make sure that you're really taking close attention to samples. And actually there's a website called whosample.com if you want to check and see if any of your works have been sampled in the past. Next. I think Dennis is up.
I think I'm up. Okay, so first, I don't know how I got to be the lone male in a panel with all these smart and knowledgeable women, but I'm going to take it as a compliment. So I do want to say, kind of before we even get into this a little bit, we've touched on this issue of reciprocity, and I just want to point out how important this is. We had some legislation in the U.S. It really was the Audio Home Recording Act and the Digital Millennium Copyright Act that gave us the first parts of reciprocity. But because we don't have protection for terrestrial radio in this country, that means that when songs that you performed on are performed in Europe and in Asia, in most situations, you're not going to get paid because we don't have a terrestrial right here. So I want to kind of take this point in our place here to say that it's very important. SONA is a wonderful organization and is very active legislatively. And I just want to kind of get it on everybody's radar screen that you need to be supporting copyright legislation here that provides terrestrial rights. We have, currently the AM/FM Act that'll help do that. We've had a number of iterations of that in the past, but they are to do that. One of the exceptions is that if you actually record in the U.S., but you own the master and you register with that in a foreign territory, you can actually get paid as the rights owner, even though you're not being paid as the performer. And in most situations, they'll pay 100% of that money to you as the rights holder. So you actually do get the performer share and the rights holder share. If you're just on the record and a record company that licenses it and registers those in foreign territories, just the record company is going to get paid. So I just don't want to leave this without saying how important this is. So anyway, so I think we've really touched on Sound Exchange quite a bit, but I'll just hit on a couple of things. Sound Exchange is one of the few organizations, perhaps the only one, where you don't have to have the rights owner doesn't have to register the work. So as a performer, you can actually register with Sound Exchange and make your claim. They base their claims on airplay data and frequency data. They get from primarily the DSPs, digital service providers here in the US. So basically, Sound Exchange collects for webcasting and subscription services, which is quite remarkable considering the volume of revenue that comes from that, just from those, primarily from those two sources. We do have private copy protection in the US through an organization called ISrc, but in the US they're very, very tiny, but it does give us the right to collect those in other areas. So the way this works is Sound Exchange collects all the money. They give 50% to the rights holder, which is the record company or the person who owns the copyright to the sound recording, which is pretty common throughout the rest of the world. And then here, Sound Exchange pays 45% to the featured performers, divided among them, which may include, as Shari mentioned earlier, if you're a producer with a LOD, you can actually share in that. Then they pay 5% under the AFAR and SAG-AFTRA Intellectual Property Rights Distribution Fund, who then have to split those royalties up among everybody. So that's how it works here. It is kind of an outlier in the way it works in the rest of the world. And Sound Exchange does have bilateral agreements, by the way, from other territories. So you may or may not see foreign monies flowing through Sound Exchange. And I have to go to the next slide. So we've talked about this. I think we haven't touched on this yet, mandates. And what is a mandate? We hear this word bantered around a lot. And basically, I think the best way to look at a mandate, it's really a limited power of attorney. It allows someone, either you directly, to collect your royalties or to assign someone to do it. So if you have a mandate, which everybody has a mandate, you all own your mandates, with the exception of how the unions view them here. We'll touch on that in a second. But basically, that's your power of attorney to authorize someone to go collect your money for you. So you can give that to an agent, you can assign it to an agent, you can assign it, and then that agent in turn can go collect from CMOs for you. They can register with one particular CMO, they can register with multiple CMOs, or you can go directly to a CMO and you can register with that. So the difference here is very interesting. In Europe and Asia, the rule is very clear that it's viewed that the performer owns their mandate, meaning you have the total control over deciding who gets to collect for you. If you want to assign to an agent, sign up directly with a CMO, you can do that. And there are certain rules. Some societies will only allow you to change, within a certain amount of months for distribution. Some you can do it every year. But the bottom line is that you own that mandate, and that's your right to assign that. And what appears to be a very complicated chart here really just lays it out as how the money flows. You can assign your mandate to someone, they collect the money, they either send it to your agent or back directly to you. This does differ in the US. Now, I will say it's kind of a point of contention, and probably one of the reasons that IAFAR was actually formed was to deal with this. And the difference is that in the US, the two major entertainment unions, SAG-AFTRA and the American Federation of Musicians, view this a little bit differently. They view that the mandate is actually owned by the union themselves. And there are some case law in the US which would support that because unions have a different bargaining relationship here. And when you join the union, you basically sign up to assign them your rights as their sole bargaining representative. And then there's this little known bylaw that also says they get to collect your royalties domestically and internationally. So it has been a point of contention, but you'll find that if you're a member of one of the unions, the AFM and SAG-AFTRA fund is authorized to collect on your behalf, or if you're a featured performer, you need to register with Sound Exchange. And they actually have your mandate then, but the unions actually control that. So what happens if you want somebody else to collect foreign monies for you, you need to get a release of that mandate. And without getting into a lot of the issues, SAG-AFTRA has been actually fairly lenient in terms of releasing the mandates, and the AFM is much more difficult about the release of mandates. So it is a point of contention, but what happens is if you try to then issue that mandate to somebody else, and the AFM is also asserting a mandate, rather than have the royalties go to one party or the other, they'll actually be blocked. So you might find your situation where you're trying to claim royalties in a foreign territory. The AFM SAG-AFTRA fund is trying to do that for you as well. And what happens is they just freeze those royalties till it's resolved. So this is a problem. IAFAR is working diligently to try to resolve that. But it is an interesting sort of difference. Now, if you're not a member of the union, and I will say at times the unions assert those, even if you perform on one particular recording or a TV show, you might have been what's called Taft-Hartley. So what happens, you may not be a member of a union, but you're allowed to work on a union contract. And the union also asserts a mandate on those situations. So it's a complicated area. If you do get confused about that, or if you have some questions about mandates, I would say contact one of us and we'll be happy to walk you through some of the ways that we can resolve those, or at least tell you what goes on with those. The way it does work, before we leave this slide, I do want to say that technically the mandates allow the AF and SAG-AFTRA fund to collect foreign royalties for you. If you're not a member, actually technically that fund is not allowed to collect your foreign mandates. So if you're not a member, even though you're getting the monies domestically from the AF and SAG-AFTRA fund, you do need to register with an agent or a CMO to help you collect those foreign monies. I think our next slide. So I get all the fun stuff here. So so production music is also one of the other complicated areas. And I will say that from the time, you can tell I've been in the business a long time. You can tell by all the gray hair, and I've been here for a while. So I've seen a lot of changes happen. Production music, when I started in the business, really was one sort of thing. It was music. It was primarily orchestral underscore music used for bumpers and tags. It would be sort of the anonymous music that would be on, on station IDs on the radio. Would be logos for different types of shows. Sometimes it would be a piece of underscore that someone didn't really deliver on that they would add into a movie or a TV show, but they were generally pretty anonymous, generic pieces of music. They didn't really sound much like sound recordings. They really sounded, in those days, really like pieces of underscore. And it would be titled things like Romantic Theme Number 1, Romantic Theme Number 2, Seascape 4, so very generic kind of to get people an idea of what they were licensed for. And as a rule, they were attached only to audiovisual product, and they did not generate any kind of neighboring right. That sort of changed for two reasons. One, as audiovisual rights began to collect neighboring rights, we now see that a lot of production music licensed into TV shows would otherwise be subject to audiovisual rights. If it's identified strictly as production music, the majority of the societies won't pay. So one of the things you want to do is you want to attach an ISRC to every piece of production music. And then if they're treated in any way like a sound recording, it's a real plus, because that's going to help you get paid when those are licensed in for shows or use the station IDs. So an ISRC is really critical for those things to be credited. And the other part I want to say about production music that I think is fascinating is I've watched it change in its landscape tremendously. As I said before, it used to be sort of generic underscore music that people sort of counted as sort of anonymous background music. Now, a lot of production music and every other aspect looks and sounds very much like a sound recording. And it sounds much like the sound recordings you would hear on Spotify and Sirius XM. It's just that it's designed to take a place, to be licensed into those shows. We've also seen that a number of artists actually have broken new recordings via production music. And those things we're seeing greater and greater use, and we're seeing more neighboring rights. We're also seeing the use, not just in audio visual, but we're seeing it attached to other programs. We're seeing other things that it is. So to get credit for an audio visual work, Q-Sheet credit is a must. And I want to say that that's really important. The other big thing, the big problem about production music, and it's a culture we've had, and I know that there are a lot of people in Sony who are actually involved now in making production music. At one point, this was like something that was very, very specific. It was really done primarily in Europe. It didn't affect us here. There's a great deal of production music that's been made right here in the US. And one of the things that's been a problem beforehand is a lot of the companies that make production music, they related to a composer. They tracked the uses so they could actually make pay a composer, whatever their side deal with that composer, but they didn't credit any of the musicians on those recordings. And part of that was the reason that led to a lot of the societies not wanting to deal with production music, because they couldn't really identify any of the performers. Of course, now, with the importance of metadata, I just want to say that if you're involved in production music, things like the ISRC are important. Q-sheet credit, whenever that happens, make sure you track that. But the other thing is to make sure that those recordings are registered, and make sure whoever is the rights holder for that. So if you own the rights to that, make sure you register with those with various CMOs. If not, urge the company that does the production music that you have your deal with to do that. And more importantly, make sure that the metadata includes all the performers on that. Otherwise, they won't get paid. And if they don't get paid, you may find yourself kind of out of the loop as well. So I think that covers production music. And let's see here, where are we next? I think we've kind of covered this, but I just want to kind of wrap this up and say that we touched this before. In the U.S., our money is generated because of subscription services, and primarily it almost all comes from subscription services. Webcasting is a smaller portion, but it does, add up. But we don't really get paid for broadcast performances here. So in other words, terrestrial radio, AM, FM radio does not pay us what it pays in Europe. And in Europe and Asia, the bulk of this money does come from public performance, so broadcast. So I think there's a lot of factors here. Now, I don't want to gloss over this. You may record the music here in the U.S. If you have dual citizenship. For example, if you if you live in the U.S. but you either are a U.S. citizen and you hold dual citizenship, or you're a UK citizen, then you're going to qualify for neighboring rights, even though the recordings were done here. I think as by just a way of example, we had a situation quite some time ago on Michael Jackson record, Billie Jean. It has a really prominent string section, one of the few pop records where the strings are like really, really prominent. And oddly enough, the two people involved that were Jeremy Lubbock, who's a UK citizen, and a guy named Reg Hill, who was a violinist. Reg, I don't even believe had U.S. citizenship. He lived here. He had a work visa. He was working here. Played on a number of recordings here, but he was a UK citizen. And we were able to get a claim for Reg on that recording, and he was the only person in the string section who got paid for that recording. Everybody else was recorded in the U.S., produced by Quincy Jones. So the only two people got paid. Jeremy Lubbock was paid because he was the conductor, conducted the string session, and was the arranger on it. He wasn't paid for being the arranger in Europe. He was paid because he conducted, and it was probably the only sort of non-audible role. So a conductor is considered to be eligible for neighboring rights, even though their performance is not audible as a conductor, but that's counted as an audible role. And the other person who got paid out of a 20-person string section was Reg Hill. So citizenship is really important. So where the recording is either made or where the person is a citizen, or in many cases, people aren't aware of it, a band may be all U.S. musicians, they're on tour, say you're on tour with Phil Collins and you record a live album in Germany. Well, then that album will be subject to neighboring rights because it was recorded in a Rome Convention country. So those are really important distinctions, a lot of things to really keep track of. And I think that basically wraps this up here. I think that's a good point to move on.
Yeah, and just to thank you for that, and then just to say, This is the discount code is at the bottom of this. So please, please, please become a member. As I'm sure you've been able to tell, there's a lot of issues with this income stream. And the only way that we can really be effective and really tackle the issues is to have, strong membership, to be able to have the support that we need in order to deal with some of the issues that we've mentioned, in order to try and make this a more transparent income stream. And in order to really try and help as many people as we can as well. So Abby, I know you've got a few questions to start us off with, and then I believe the Q&A section is now open. You're on mute.
You'd think after like 150 webinars that I would remember to unmute. First of all, I want to thank you all. That was really tremendous. There's so much information in there and can't thank you enough. So the first, these are things actually you did touch on, but just maybe for a little bit more clarification. The first one is the national treatment in Canada that US performers may receive. And the second one is maybe a little bit of a overview of the recent EU announcement regarding national treatment there.
So in Canada, national treatment, so when we say national treatment, we mean like American citizens, for instance, who were previously non-qualifying in Canada because of the reciprocity issues. Now, as of July 1st, they are going to be paid in Canada. They're backdating just that until January 1st, 2020. So anything prior to
July 1st. July 1st.
No, I know, but payments are coming from January 1st.
Yes.
So they're looking at logs from January 1st, but it's effective as of July 1st. So, prior to that, Americans obviously were not qualifying in Canada. If you performed on a recording, you weren't paid. However, now you will be. So that's a really good step forward. There is recent EU legislation, EU ruling rather. It settled a case between RAAP, which is the Performer Society in Ireland, and PPI, which is a label society in Ireland, the ruling has said that you can't discriminate against anybody based on their citizenship. So it's essentially a ruling in favor of national treatment. I wouldn't get too excited right now. First of all, I think this is a very different income stream than publishing. A lot of it is manual. There's a lot of societies that, are sort of working off of spreadsheets and whatnot, and you have your own set of issues dealing with that. But forget everything else. There's going to be a long process to try and make any changes. And then, I believe there might be a few, people who are not happy with this ruling that, would potentially try and contest it. And then you also have societies that will pay based on the country of essentially the label owner, as opposed to who's paid for the recording, not necessarily based on citizenship. So those countries still aren't going to pay, if it's an American recording. I don't know if anybody wants to add to that, but don't get excited. You're not going to get a windfall tomorrow.
No,
go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, no, one thing I wanted to say about just going back to the court case that involved Ireland. So the reason why that court case sort of happened at all was because the non-qualifying performer share in Ireland is actually paid to the record companies. So that was what the argument was about to begin with. So the Performer Society said that, well, it shouldn't be up to you to take that money and just pay it through to the labels. It's actually performer share. So we should get that and either qualify all performers, or it should go at least to the performer community. So that's how it started. And that is actually something that happens in a number of other countries as well, UK being one of them, where non-qualifying performer shares are actually paid to the labels. Same thing happens in Australia. While in other countries, if the performer doesn't qualify, it usually goes back into the performer pot and then split among performers. But those are kind of occasions where it's been decided that it's the label who will get the performer share, so they get more than the 50% in these instances. So that's what kind of kickstarted the whole thing. And I do agree with what Naomi said. It's probably going to be a long road ahead to kind of get that ruling implemented. We'll have to see what happens. There are of course parties who are already raising their concerns, and we can guess who they are based on what we just said. But yeah, it's not going to happen tomorrow for sure.
I think it's important to know too that we've had for a long time, WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Rights Organization, had a long-standing principle about no collection without distribution. Now that sounds great, but a lot of societies say, well, we've either collected it, we've distributed it to the label, so they've done that. In other cases, they just basically have ignored that. So, well, I think this is, some landmark decisions. I agree with Ann and Naomi. It's going to take a long time to sort this out. I want to remind everybody that even in the U.S., in the time that the Digital Millennium Copyright Act was enacted, and before the first payment, because there were a number of court battles, and then we had a CRB, the Copyright Tribunal, that set the rates. It was something like 4 years before a single payment went out to anybody after the court decision was finalized, due to like the various appeals and stuff like that. So this is going to be the legislation that we're talking about is fairly arcane. It's going to be subject to a lot of interpretation. We're going to have a lot of people saying what it really means and reading that. So I think it's significant. I don't want anybody to get the notion that this is in any way a substitute for really fighting for truly terrestrial rights in this country. I just want to keep hammering that home to everybody how.
And to add to all of that, and an opportunity that you are a qualifying performer, but you need to make sure you're registered with the CMO that's representing you worldwide, or each CMO if you go that route, because there's money left on the table, and most times there's a term limit to collect those rights. And Sound Exchange, it goes about 3 years from the day of the recording. PPL goes back about 6 years, I believe. It might be a little longer. The longest I've seen is maybe 9 years. And then Germany pays late, so there's not a lot of opportunity. The only CMO that I know of worldwide that doesn't actually let you directly register with them is the AFM and SAG-AFTRA Fund. They have a research team that finds you and researches the complete lineup as they research the qualified recordings they're distributing upon.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you all. All right, I'm going to start going through the Q&A. First one, when Sound Exchange or PPL pays neighboring rights, 50% to the sound recording, 50% to the artist, I'm reading the question verbatim, is the 50% to artist direct or through the label?
That's what basically Anne was talking about a little bit. In some societies, like PPL in the UK, RAAP, in Ireland, the money is paid to the performer unless it's a non-qualifying performer, in which case then the non-qualifying share is paid to the label. All countries that pay a qualifying performer, or even if they pay the non-qualifying performer, so Spain or Germany or something, if you're paying a performer share, you're going to pay that performer. You're not going to pay the money to the label unless it's a non-qualifying performer share, in which case the non-qualifying money might go to the label depending on the country.
And does Sound Exchange have that same concept of non-qualifying?
No, Sound Exchange pays everybody. There's no qualification issues with Sound Exchange. You just, they need to know who you are. You need to make sure you're signed up.
Right, it's pretty automatic. They divide the money in half. Half goes to the label, half goes to 45% goes to the featured performers collectively, and 5% to the AFAR SAG-AFTRA Fund to distribute to non-featured performers. They do it kind of on a proxy system. They don't really pay every single non-featured performer on every single recording. They have a research floor. They basically research roughly 20,000 recordings for each distribution, and then the money earned for all the recordings gets put in that pot of those 20,000 recordings, and then there's a pro rata share for each recording, and then a pro rata share for each performer on those recordings.
That's for the non-featured. For the featured, Sound Exchange has percentages. So Sound Exchange will pay the featured artist based on the percentages that they have.
And Sound Exchange would not pay the featured performer to the sound recording owner, correct?
No.
They pass through the 5%, whether on each track there are non-featured performers or not. So the 5% will automatically be deducted and go through. And then what Dennis was saying, then that rolls into this pot of how it's distributed among the 20,000 tracks they may be researching. It might be more now, we're not sure. We've been gone a little while.
All right, here's the next question. If you own the master rights and it's if you own the master rights and you're an instrumentalist, let's say a guitarist, should you register yourself as a guitarist in addition to sound recording owner?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You're entitled to more than the 50% as a rights holder. You're entitled to every penny on every roll code that you perform on.
Great, thank you. Okay, because of reciprocity, what happens to the money collected for a US artist in an ex-US territory? For example, what happens to performance money collected in Australia for a US artist signed to a US label?
So this is like an interesting question, and it varies from territory to territory. Many societies have what's called like a cultural enrichment fund. And that's a fancy way of saying they keep the money, which is, and but in some of it goes to, you know, to promote concerts or their cultural enrichment of their own performers. You know, it's all over the map. The bottom line is that if it's not a qualifying recording, then that money and it's registered, then it all goes to the rights holder. But if it's not registered at all, then it's a question whether they're actually collecting any money for that recording. So there's so many circumstances, depends on every circumstance, every territory, what their own regulations are in terms of all that. But I'd say that the bottom line is make sure that the rights owner registers the sound recording in all those territories, and then who actually gets those rights depends on a whole host of factors, you know, the citizenship of the performers, the location of the recording. Some societies will even pay on what's called simultaneous release. So if you release the record within 30 or 60 days, some territories. So the answer to that is it varies from territory to territory.
Right.
But for Australia specifically, because I think that was mentioned in the question there. So although Australia did sign the Rome Convention, but with reservations, that means that they're actually not paying to international performers, and they would pay that to the label. That money would go to the label.
There's a question here that is, I think maybe there's some confusion, so I'm going to paraphrase. It relates to ISRCs with production music. So if the sound recording is not being released commercially, should we still register the ISRCs of these production music cues?
If you can. I mean, there are going to be some countries where you won't be able to. Like in PPL in the UK, for instance, you can't. If you're a production music library and you've got yourself set up as production music house on MCPS, which is the Mechanical Society, then you won't be able to, PPL won't pay you because there's a triple weighting system with MCPS that essentially is supposed to cover this, you know, that area of the industry. But other societies like Abramus in Brazil, you know, you can earn a tremendous amount of money, you know, from production music.
Great, thank you. Okay, where should one put the musician's credit in metadata? There's no field for it on most platforms, for example, iTunes, Disco, etc.
Well, iTunes is not collecting neighboring rights. Number one, that is an interactive service. We're talking about neighboring rights here, where you would get metadata sheet, probably facilitated by the collective management organization. Each one has its own way that you report data. I would love for Naomi and Anne to chime in on this as well, because I think the question related to interactive services when I read it on the Q&A. So.
Yeah, I mean, if you're uploading your information onto iTunes, you know, as Shari said, and you know, and I think we said during the presentation, iTunes isn't going to pay neighboring rights. That's not where you need to put the metadata that we're talking about. The metadata that you need to make sure you include is when you register that on the PPL system or on the SENA system, or you know, in whatever neighboring rights society you are going to be registering those recordings. That's the place where you need to put the metadata. If you've only been putting your stuff on iTunes and you've never registered any of your tracks at any neighboring rights society, then, or if you have but not put all the metadata, it's potentially invalid. You've probably not been getting paid, and you can't backdate, so you've sort of lost that money. You need to make sure you register with the societies. Anne, is there anything to?
No, that's, you know, that is exactly it. You know, as we said before, there's different ways you can do it. You can go yourself directly to each individual society. It's a lot of work. You can use an agent who would do that work for you. you can sign up with a CMO, a collection management organization, for them to look after it for you for sort of outside your home territory. Those are kind of the different scenarios, but yeah, and there's different methods of actually getting that information to the individuals CMOs. Some of them have portals you can need to go in, claim track by track. Some of them would allow you to send a sheet in Excel format or whatever. So yeah, it varies from society to society.
So for that person to ask the question, if we are talking about the United States, we recommend that you either solicit an agent or register with Sound Exchange, in addition to registering your tracks with iTunes or an aggregator like TuneCore or DistroKids.
Thank you. Okay, this is a tough one. If I am a US and EU citizen and signed up with a company in France to collect neighboring rights and assume they did registrations properly, and I have 3,000 recordings and over 60 movie scores and TV scores, and I've only seen a few $100 in 3+ years, what do you think went wrong?
So, you know, we get this, and it's interesting because it's not so much the volume that you've written or released, it's really what gets used and what's really so what finds its way to those different platforms. In the United States, for example, it really is, you know, it has to be like a subscription service for webcasting. So you may have a song that plays on terrestrial radio here, and it just never finds a way to a subscription service. You may have a song that does that has sold a lot of vinyl recordings or hard copies of something in a European territory, but it's not broadcast on the radio. So either I'd say that there's a registration problem, you know, so first of all, make sure that everything is registered. So I'm not sure in this question, I know the performer has dual citizenship, he or she, correct? So they're a citizen of a Rome Convention country, I'm assuming. So they're going to be subject to that. So assuming that the sound recordings are registered correctly, they should be seeing something, assuming that the product is really actually broadcast on places they're going to pay. So you may have, for example, music that's licensed a great deal for one specific type of use, but not necessarily broadcast. So you may not generate the money. It really is. It's not so many how many tracks you have, but really how many times those tracks are used. I do want to say one thing I wanted to mention about audiovisuals, slightly off this, but it's funny how the different territories. So for U.S. performers, I want to say that we really see audiovisual rights only in 3 territories: Spain, Germany, and Brazil. And that's sort of, in a way, germane to this person's question, is, you know, that sometimes you just think you're active in some territories. So one of the things that I always tell clients and friends are look at your statement from your PRO. So if you're seeing, for example, a lot of money in your PRO from certain territories, but you see 0 income from that territory in terms of neighboring rights, my guess is that your recordings are somehow not registered correctly. You're seeing money as a writer and a publisher, so that sound recording is having some use, but it's obviously falling through the cracks somehow. So you need to compare those statements, but look at what's really used in those territories.
There's also, as I sort of mentioned before, different territories will pay on different criteria. So obviously your French agent probably has registered you for the world or is supposed to or whatever, but in France, they will only pay neighboring rights if the recording is a qualifying recording. So if it's owned by a Rome Convention entity. So you're most likely not going to get money from France if it's been recorded and everything here in the US. So, you know, that's the other thing to consider is if you're getting, as Dennis said, where are you getting the airplay? If you've got a ton of AV and you're not getting airplay in Spain, Brazil, or Germany, you're probably not going to get much money in this income stream. If you've recorded it and it's owned by, or the person who paid for it is from a US company or it's a US entity, and you're getting a ton of airplay in France and the Netherlands, it doesn't actually matter where you're a citizen, you're still not going to get paid for it because it's going to be non-qualifying according to their regulations. So, you know, where are you getting the airplay? If you're getting billions of streams on Spotify, but you're not getting any radio play, you know, chances are you're probably not going to be earning much money on this income stream.
Okay, so there's a question about cue sheets. And I'm just going to say here in the US, we do not include an ISRC on a cue sheet, and we don't list musicians on a cue sheet. Anne and Naomi, what do you see on cue sheets outside of the US?
I mean, I have never seen or heard any neighboring rights society who ask for a cue sheet. I mean, I used to work in publishing, so I'm very familiar with cue sheets. And nobody is actually asking for those as far as I'm aware in neighboring rights. We've never had that question at Kobalt. Yes. Naomi, have you got any other experiences there?
I believe that like the BBC submits cue sheets to PPL. I believe that that's all part of sort of their submission process.
The purpose yeah, I'm sorry.
No, go on.
We do collect cue sheets at the AFM and SAG-AFTRA Fund. The purposes of the non-reciprocal monies that come in from Spain and Germany. The reason for those cue sheets is twofold. One is to identify the licensed tracks that are coming in, so we can pay on that revenue stream for any tracks licensed into a motion picture or television film. And the other is to identify the underscore, which is usually supported by union contracts. And that's how the research team at the fund does that, and that's why they need the cue sheets. Years ago, Dennis and I negotiated a deal with ASCAP to provide those cue sheets to the fund to further identify.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm really sorry to interrupt you, Naomi. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
No, I say, in general, you're right. ISRCs will not be included on cue sheets. The cue sheets really help you identify what the piece of music is, and if we have an ISRC, it's going to help you whittle that down if there's like something with a similar or the same title or something like that. So it really is an extra identifier, or if it's used something that's not as part of like a motion picture or television film, but if it's used in some other fashion, you know, that generates some other kind of airplay, then the ISRC is going to help you get paid.
Here's a question. Is Sound Exchange collecting on anything other than non-interactive? In the Sound Exchange, there's reciprocity in most non-US territories for the non-interactive digital performances, but not terrestrial performance. Is this true?
So anything, if you've signed up with Sound Exchange for the world, and then they send your name to all the different societies around the world, any money you get for anything that those societies will pay for, Sound Exchange will pass through to you. So if you've got public performance income, terrestrial radio income, etc., from Spain, for instance, then Sound Exchange will pay that to you because it's just everything that you've earned from Spain. In the US territory, you know, they're only going to pay from the sources that pay them. But, you know, they will pay everything that's paid to them, even though there's reciprocity issues. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And the fund, just to further elaborate on that, the fund collects also for audiovisual, for the non-featured artists, for the neighboring rights, and they also collect for private copy, exclusive licensing that comes in from France, and there's a lot of bilateral and multilateral agreements that were done between the fund, Sound Exchange, and foreign territories that allowed some passing through of some royalties that don't have direct reciprocity. Unfortunately, terrestrial radio is not one of them, and one of the biggest money grabs out there. That's why there's so much fighting going on to get this legislation passed in the United States for the equal treatment.
So we have 5 more minutes. I'm going to ask this question. Here's the question. The question relates to sound recordings from, let's say, soundtrack albums as compared to sound recordings that are part of score, a film or TV score. How can musicians find out how they have been registered or if they've been registered as performers? Boy,
that's it's such a, you know, every organization is a little bit different. So one of the things that, we'll say that, I'll start with the easiest ones. There are unclaimed royalty checks. You can go to the AFM SAG-AFTRA Fund and see if your name's on the unclaimed royalty list. Sound Exchange maintains a similar list. Most other societies don't maintain that. So you can go for example, go online at PPL, and if the sound recording is registered, and you can see, and if you were credited in that, you can look at that. These are, I honestly say that a lot of these systems are set up to make it harder for someone to really know. And that's one of the frustrating things I was asked. That's kind of a mission of IAFAR, is to make it easier for performers. And that's one of the things that I think as an agency that we sort of, all of us do. We sort of, it's a white gloves kind of service that larger organizations can't do. Sound Exchange is not going to go through and make sure that the registration is correct every society. What comes through the door, they're going to pay out. I'm not criticizing them for that. It's a different model. They're not going to, but an agent's going to look at your statement and say, this was a top 10 record. You had a whole bunch of money in Italy and no place else. How is that? And why is that? And you're going to start to search the other places. So it is very, very difficult for an individual performer to do that. And I'm not sure I have a magic bullet way to tell them to do it. I would look at some of the websites. There's a number of things out there to see if you've been registered, but you have to really, if you're a performer, if you're the rights holder, it's much easier because you control the registration and you control who's listed on that. So you can actually have a much greater control as a rights holder. Even if you are not a featured performer, you could be a mega star, but you don't own your masters. You run the risk of not being registered correctly every place, and it's going to be very difficult to always know that. So we've seen a lot of things where oftentimes too, things get lost in translation a great deal. I mean, we have sort of laughed at some way the names get mangled in some territories, but if you really know the person's name, you can find it. Most things like Sound Exchange, if it's not a computer match, it's not a match. So they're not going to look through and see how Beyonce's name got mangled in Latvia. They're just not going to do that. Where one of us is going to look through and say, we know that's her and that's our client, and we're going to go, we'll straighten that out. So I wish there was a real easy way to do it. Maybe somebody else has some better advice than I have, but I'm afraid it's not that easy.
You can become a member of IAFAR. We can try and answer some of your questions. And then we've got a committee of people who aren't representatives who can give you a list of representatives, and you can talk to each of the different representatives and figure out who might help you the most and be most appropriate for, the sorts of things that you need. And then you sign up with.
IAFAR is not a collective management organization. We're a nonprofit educational advocacy group here to support the artists, the music creators in this business, and that's what we do. We know how much trouble it is to go ahead and create music, let alone being able to work on the business side of this all, and that's what we're here to help you do.
I think it's just about time to wrap it up. There's one thing that I think we need to clarify. It feels like, based upon a lot of the questions that were coming in at the end. Number one, if I'm a performer, does the sound recording owner have to register the recordings before I can collect?
Yes, unless it's Sound Exchange in the US.
Okay, so that's a really important one for everyone to understand. Like, you got to make sure that the sound recording is registered. The only society where the performers will register is Sound Exchange. Everywhere else, the performer is reliant on the sound recording owner. The second thing I think we really need, the second thing I really want.
Sorry, Abby, can I just say something on that? Because yes, so the record company needs to first register, and then you can go in and claim your performance on that recording. It doesn't stop there though. You can't just do it once and think that it will be fine. You need to go back and double check that you haven't fallen off a recording or that anyone has been added on that shouldn't be there. So it's not a one-time job. It's constant that you need to go in, because the record companies, they push through additional releases. They might have changed something on their system, and it kind of could override what's already in the society's database there. So check again and again. Don't sort of just leave it once you've done it once.
Oh, that's great information. Okay, the final one, this is related to the US. So as a performer, a featured performer, I need to register with Sound Exchange. As a non-featured, I need to have my information at AFM SAG-AFTRA. How does that work? The Intellectual Property Distribution Fund. Can we talk?
Okay, so you need to register with Sound Exchange if you're a featured performer. A lot of featured performers also have non-featured performances. They actually are guest, a guest performer on somebody else's record. They might be a singer-songwriter, but they play guitar on somebody else's record. So the fund, you don't really register at the AFM SAG-AFTRA fund independently. They will find you. The only thing you can do there is to go to the unclaimed list and see if your name is on that.
No, they don't do that anymore. They don't.
Well,
do
the unclaimed list you can go to, but you just can't look at the sound.
You could see what was released over the last several distributions, and if you haven't received a check from the fund, then I would go ahead and make a claim on that recording with the fund, which they have mechanisms for doing so.
Okay, so we've got two places. It's just there's the sound exchange place, and then there's the fund place, and you need to be monitoring both if you want to.
And if you have international airplay, separately do something different outside of the US.
That's great. Everybody, thank you so much. It was really wonderful. Really appreciate all your time and all of the information. And just again, one more time, people attending, if you've got questions, please join IAFAR and please feel free to ask those questions. One question that has come up repeatedly is how do people get the slides and will this presentation?
If you join IAFAR, then there's a members only portion of our website. We always add slides to that. There's slides from past webinars as well, which are, similar, have similar content. This will be up, these slides will be up soon as well. And you can always join and then see it through the members only portion of the website. If you want to get really involved, we'd love to have people who want to be on committees, who want to be active, who want to help us out. But you have to join in order for that to happen.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great
week.
Great day.
See ya.